Hello and welcome to episode 24 of my NASA series. Changing things up a little bit, experimenting with some new fonts, and just jumping straight into the video instead of having the 5 or 6 seconds of just dead air at the beginning. Still trying to work out a suitable tow bar for my rovers for use on Duna. You can see the adjustments I've made to the expeditionary vehicle, and I'm going to add the extra battery power to all my other designs too, but just testing ways of more reliably towing stuff. Still not entirely happy with this, but it is better than what I had before. Problem is those struts being physics-less parts and being assembled in with KAS attachment. They're not exactly the stiffest thing. You can see them start pulling apart even. But the tow bar does give a little bit of improvement. I'm pretty happy with that. Still gonna mess around, see if I can find something better. And as I promised, further mishaps with the K-38 Talon. I got the first overflight zone for this aerial survey mission and decided to pull a pretty tough bank over to head to the next one. Didn't quite work out, and in fact this one, even after dumping fuel, I couldn't save it. I ended up having to punch out and just let it crash. Tried dumping not all of the fuel, but just most of it, and that didn't exactly work out. Once I could see the landing lights reflecting off the ground, I figured it was a pretty good time to get out of the aircraft. And in retrospect, one of the things I was running into with that plane is being very short. It's very susceptible to becoming longitudinally unstable. Airplanes like the GB had similar issues. So we've gone into yet another redesign, and in doing so I have, this is probably the next time I've said this, built one of the best planes I've ever built in this series. This thing flies really well. But you can see it looks more like a normal aircraft with the control surfaces I've got. The flaps are independent of the ailerons. The ailerons aren't really that huge because it's got pretty good roll authority as it is. But it's very stable, very easy to fly. Even so, since I was having such bad luck with my aircraft designs lately, I decided to do a profile flight in this thing, just to make sure it handled as I expected it would. .209 knots is pretty fast for a touchdown, but it's not that bad. KSP has some pretty forgiving parts physics when it comes to landing gear. Encountering our old faux wheelbarrowing there. Accidentally had the nose wheel hit first. And once again. Just about lost it because I wasn't exactly flying it at my best. And instead of recovering, since a tank of fuel goes so far in this game, I decided to just taxi down to the end of the runway, turn around, and take off again for our survey mission. And if you're going to be designing aircraft in Kerbal Space Program, one of the things I highly recommend is messing with your thrust limiters and your control surface authority limits. In reality, I base this off the real T-38 Talon, which has a thrust-to-weight ratio maximum of about, I think, 0.43. I calculated that out by taking the thrust of each engine, multiplying by 2, because there's 2 engines, and then using the weight of the fully loaded T-38. This is just a single engine. I wasn't really happy with all my solutions for getting a twin engine set up, and I don't have to worry about engine failures in this game, so I just decided to keep it single engine. But with a thrust-to-weight ratio of less than 1, it's a lot easier to make a landing. You have finer control over your speeds. And unfortunately, I probably should have been paying attention as I was flying this, because just about smacked right into the side of that mountain. Yeah, at that point, I decided to stop admiring the terrain and go to a safe 10,000 meters, which is about 30,000 feet. A little more. But figured that'd be a safe buffer zone between me and any unintended controlled flight into terrain. Just kind of admiring the view out of this cockpit on my way out to the survey zones. Was quite a long flight, but once again, I kind of enjoy flying. Well, I really enjoy flying. Doesn't matter what game I'm playing. I even take Arma 2 out and just start goofing off with helicopters every once in a while. So I hit that overflight zone, turning over to the next one while gaining altitude. These were pretty low, and I was worried because they were in some kind of mountainous terrain. At least they appeared to be on the map view, and so I was concerned that I might actually not be able to safely approach them. But I decided to drop down low to take a nice look at the Great Lake before pulling back up so I could get over the mountains. Finally hitting our third survey point. I'm assuming they're using infrared, because there's no way you're seeing through those clouds. Yeah, doing these flights, I do enjoy doing them, and they kind of fit with the theme of my playthrough, because one of the big things that NASA is into is atmospheric research using different aircraft. They have their fleet of T-38s, but they're starting to be supplanted. Well, I say that. They have a couple T-38s, but they only have like 4 F-18s painted up in NASA colors for aerial research. One of the most interesting of which is an F-18 that's experimenting with aeroelastic wings. It doesn't have any traditional control surfaces on the wings, and it actually changes the shape of them to alter its maneuvers. That is way beyond the scope of what I'm able to pull off with current mods, but NASA isn't just spaceflight, it's National Aeronautics and Space Administration, so there's a lot going on the cutting edge of aerodynamics. This is actually pretty boring stuff. This would be more analogous to some of the atmospheric research flights they do. And as a challenge to myself, I decided to see if I could bring this thing in without SAS engaged. I'm using flight assistants like, you can see I've got the leveler engaged and pitch dampener, but I'm basically just flying this down using the throttle, like you would in a real actual aircraft. And I ended up pulling off one of my better landings, actually. 2 hours and 44 minutes. That was pretty much a flight halfway around the world, but it was because of Kerbin's rotation, it was actually faster to turn around and fly the way I came instead of trying to turn around or keep going. Sorry. And with an eve window coming up, I've decided to start putting some more long-range communications infrastructure in orbit. And I'm trying to experiment with low-cost launchers. I thought about flying these up on the space shuttle, but seeing as the last communications relay I tried to launch with the shuttle didn't quite reach the expected altitude, I decided to go for a low-cost expendable launcher. And I wanted to see if I could do this because I don't have any throttle control. This is just a big SRB. And in fact, the thrust-to-weight ratio as it starts to burn out gets insanely high. And one of the problems is trying to keep this thing, the trajectory shallow so I can get the most out of this booster. I encounter some extreme heating, and I was not quite as precise in my launch as I should have been for this, and we ran into a couple issues. Yes, when you start burning off KW fairings, you are really booking it. And the antenna was exposed, so it burnt that straight off. Thankfully, things went a lot better this time. I took a slightly steeper angle. It gets me out of the atmosphere faster. I don't spend as much time in the thicker atmosphere at extremely high velocity, so it really reduces the chance of things burning up. But I am aiming for a geosynchronous orbit, or kerbosynchronous orbit, however you want to say it. So that, excuse me, I can guarantee a mission has coverage no matter what side of Kerbin is facing the spacecraft. Put that simply enough. It was an extremely quick launch, as you can imagine, running into some extreme heating, and I was riding pretty close to the edge on this one, but it did survive. You can see that fairing starting to overheat. By that point, I had started to get out of the atmosphere enough that it was not an issue. And on that one single burn, was able to get a 3,000 kilometer apoapse, which is a little high, but the satellite itself does have some maneuvering capability. I wasn't necessarily trying to min-max this, but I did want to see how efficiently I could do this. I didn't want to spend a whole lot on my launch infrastructure, and that really precluded using the shuttle to get it up there, because it's a very expensive launch. Even though I get a lot of it back in the shuttle itself, the fuel, the tanks, and the SRBs expended are not an insignificant expense. Much like in real life, my space shuttle is not as cost-effective as I would like. But also, just like in real life, it looks freaking awesome, at least to my eye, so I'm going to continue using it. And those solar panels might seem a little overkill, but that folded transmitter you see there, that actually requires a heck of a lot of electric charge to keep operating, so I just decided to go totally overkill. And instead of doing my normal thing with just stacking things on the probe core, I added some structural panels so I could hide batteries inside it and make it a little more size appropriate to the transmitter. I really like that collapsible Omni antenna. It doesn't have the range of the Communitron 32, but it's not too bad. Time to adjust the orbit. And I dumped the fairings and the SRB on a suborbital trajectory, so they are going to crash back. Not going to clutter up my orbit. I did notice later on that I've actually got an Apollo era lander somewhere in a heliocentric orbit, which is kind of interesting because the same thing happened in real life with the Apollo 10 lander. The Snoopy, as it was called, is somewhere out there in a heliocentric orbit, and there's actually a effort underway to find it. Not that there's anything that can be done with it, but it'd just be kind of interesting to find the only man-rated spacecraft to ever leave Earth orbit. That was all after the test flights that had happened on Apollo 10. Apollo 10 was, when they went out to the moon, they took the lander out and did some test flights, but did not have enough fuel in the lander to land. And I think something went a little wrong in their plans for ditching it. They imagined that the mass concentrations of the moon would drag it back down, like all the others did later, but it didn't quite work out that way, and it ended up getting kicked into a heliocentric orbit last anytime anyone saw it. But there wasn't a lot of tracking going on, so no one's entirely certain exactly where it's at. This one was actually a better launch. I didn't get the periaps as high, but you see my apoapse wasn't as low. Still enough to make sure all the disposable elements get disposed of, but I got a lot more lateral velocity out of this launch. And this one was really towing the line. I think if I'd gone a couple degrees lower, I probably would have burnt it up like the first launch. But I couldn't just kick this thing into orbit and have it circularized because it's launching from the same location. And the velocities are very similar to the previous launcher. So in order to get this on the other side of Kerbin, I had to set it up in an exact, or as close as I could get, 3-hour orbital period. That gives the other satellite enough time to get on the opposite side of the planet. And when this one circularizes, they should be near as much as I can get without really breaking into a lot of math and tedium, 180 degrees out from one another. This guarantees, these are the longest range, most powerful transmitters in the remote tech pack. So this guarantees I have got good signal coming from Kerbin no matter what orientation. The only thing I could run into is if another body happens to block the signal, which is possible, particularly the sun. But about a week later, with all the infrastructure in place, we decide, well, it's time to get the Eve orbiter launched. I'm not going to send a lander this trip, because I'd really like to get Eve mapped, excuse me, to get a better idea of where I want to set something down. And so this thing is heading to Eve loaded with science experiments. I've got enough transfer windows coming up for other planets that it's really not going to be too big of an issue. Once again, making use of that collapsible antenna. And this is really more in line with my traditional probe designs. A bunch of universal storage and or D-Magic orbital science and universal storage science experiments stacked on one of those central stacks. Doesn't have a heck of a lot of thrust, but it's got plenty of fuel, so that equals a ton of delta V. I drastically overbuilt this because I would like to kick this thing over to take a peek at Gilly at some point. Planning the maneuver actually went a lot better than I was expecting it to. Just had to make some adjustments there. But it was a very long burn. You can see 2.5 minutes. It's not exceedingly long by real standards, but as far as Kerbal standards go, it's quite lengthy. Once enough time elapsed, had to make sure, I decided to get as close to my dialed in velocity as I could. But I've been running into an issue testing in my sandbox mode where I lose encounters, and you can see there I didn't get it exactly, so I had to be a little careful and make some minor adjustments to make sure I get the encounter. But as I was saying, I've been running into a lot of issues where as the SOI changes out of Kerbin, I end up losing my encounters. It's happened to me a couple times with Duna in my sandbox save when I'm testing stuff, and so I had to make sure that I was going to exit cleanly and still maintain an encounter. But that's about all I've got time for this video. Stay tuned and hopefully have some more exciting stuff coming up later.